In this slideshow I'm trying to show something of the village of Ecclesfield that would have been familiar to the Gatty family. The Gatty family lived in the vicarage from 1839 to 1903. Anything after that date, of course, they would not have known. So I've tried to pick out those buildings and areas which they would have been familiar with and which I have managed to collect photographs of. Alfred Gatty was a Doctor of Divinity. He became Sub-Dean of York, and he was Vicar of Ecclesfield from 1839 until his death in 1903. Dr. Gatty is buried at the back of the church, close by the gate that leads to the vicarage. I've found his tombstone out, and I've altered the direction of it so that you can read it as an upright. It reads as follows: "Here also rests the body of Alfred Gatty, D.D., born 18th of April 1813, died 20th of January 1903, Vicar of Ecclesfield for 63 years and Sub-Dean of York." Then follows this inscription: "Lord, I have loved the habitation of thy house, and the place where thine honour dwelleth." Now let me introduce you to his wife, Margaret. She was born Margaret Scott. Her father was chaplain to Nelson, and he was with Nelson when he was killed on the Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. She also edited a children's magazine called Aunt Judy's Magazine. In addition, she became quite an authority on seaweeds and published a now valuable book on the subject. She also wrote a book on sundials, so all in all she was a very, very industrious woman. This sundial reflects Margaret's interest in these timepieces. It's to the south of the church on the sunny side. When I took this photograph, it had the dial in place, but latterly the dial's been removed. No doubt somebody's found that they can get a little bit of money for the bronze or copper that it was made of. When I went recently, I had a good look at the sundial, and I found an inscription running round the base which reads as follows: "Watch, for ye know not the hour." Inscribed MD CCC LXII, Roman numerals for 1862, with the letters or initials MG. I'll show you that in the next photograph. Undoubtedly the initials MG stand for Margaret Gatty. Surely it might be possible to replace the dial with something a little less nickable. This is believed to be a remarkably early photograph of Ecclesfield Church. It has been said to date before 1842, which was the date that the hearse house was built, and which is not present on this photograph. But that takes some believing, because of course photography only began round about 1839, so it seems unlikely that it's as early a date as that. Nevertheless, this was how the church would have appeared when the Gatty family arrived by coach to take up his new incumbency. With this photograph we're entering the age of the postcard, very popular in Edwardian times, and of course Edwardian times ran from 1901 to 1910. It shows the hearse house which I was talking about before, and which is still to be seen on Priory Road. Its name describes its purpose. The hearse was garaged, if you can use that word. Then the hearse was garaged in that little building. This is how the interior of the church looked not long after Gatty had died, so he would have known it when it was like this. This tablet inside the church is a memorial to a certain Dr. Hawthorne. Now, Dr. Hawthorne was the doctor to the Gattys, and he's mentioned several times. So here is a definite link to the Gattys and the time of the Gattys in Ecclesfield. This plan, taken from an Ordnance Survey map, shows the relationship of the vicarage to the church. It was to the north, as you can see, and it was approached from Church Street, coloured blue, up the drive, coloured green, to the front of the house, which was away from the church. In red I've shown the footpaths that would have been taken if anyone, such as the vicar, wanted to go to the church. He would have taken either the entry from the front door to the right or from the back door to the left to get into the church. Here we are looking down on the vicarage from the church tower, which was to the south, and you can see, in addition to the original building, there is an extension running to the west, and then a smaller extension only just visible, which is also running to the west. This view of the vicarage shows the north side with the pediment over it, and which was the main entrance from the drive. This view from the south shows what was the back of the vicarage, with the 4 windows and the large shrub which had been allowed to grow on that southern sunny side until it had taken over most of the wall. Before we leave the vicarage, I'd like to show you this sketch which was done by one of the daughters, Juliana Horatia, a reference of course to the Nelson connection, and it shows the relationship between the church and the vicarage. Compare this picture, this photograph taken in 1960, with the previous drawing by Juliana Ewing, and you can see only the small differences in tree growth. The basic picture is exactly the same. In 1965, when I took this photograph, I approached the chap with his back to me and asked him why they were demolishing the vicarage, and he told me that it was because of wood rot. That may well have been the reason that it had to be demolished, but it seems a pity that no attempt was made to preserve what was a historic building. Here I'm looking south towards the church tower, with the last of the outbuildings on my left. Here are more of the outbuildings that I was able to photograph shortly before they were demolished. Having mentioned Juliana, I'd better introduce her. She was the second surviving child, and she was born on the 3rd of August 1841. During her childhood she was noted for the stories and tales that she told the other children. So it's not surprising that she became a writer of children's stories and achieved some fame, quite considerable fame during the Victorian period. She later married a Mr. Ewing, so she then became Juliana Ewing, and it was under that name that she wrote the books. Here we see her with her husband, Captain Ewing, and the dog Trouvé. He was a foundling, but she became very attached to him. As a soldier, Captain Ewing, of course, was posted to various parts of the Empire, one of which was a posting to Canada, and they did live quite a long time together in Canada, during which time Juliana quite often wrote home, pining for the village of Ecclesfield. In her letters home she often mentions her beloved Shrogs Wood, and it is a delightful place, particularly in springtime when the early spring flowers are coming out. Here my wife is examining some of the wood anemones that are to be found in profusion in the springtime. She also mentioned the brooks that flowed through the lower Shrogs Wood. There are two Shrogs, there's the upper and the lower Shrogs, and they're separated by the 20-acre field. The lower Shrogs, of course, is the part down the hill, and so that's the part that contains the brook. And here we can see it in springtime with the celandine flowers just beginning to show. This is a photograph of the upper Shrogs Wood, taken from below, looking across the 20-acre field. It's quite a recent photograph, and it was made possible by stitching together two separate photographs. It's possible to do this on the computer. After the early springtime flowers of April come the bluebells in May, and they possibly outdo in spectacle the little early flowers. Juliana kept a diary, and it mostly related to household matters, but there were one or two entries which are interesting. On one occasion she was called upon to take some soup to Whitley, probably to one of the poor parishioners over there, and it's interesting to conjecture which route she might have taken. She would certainly have had to go up the top of Burying Lane, which leads onto the Shrogs. You can see here the signpost and also the rape crop, which would be unknown in her day. Shortly after you've left Priory Road and followed the footpath, there are two ways that you can go. You can either go left to the upper Shrogs, or you can follow this path down to lower Shrogs. And this is a useful path if you want to go to Whitley. It's not the only path, but it's probably the most convenient one. When you reach the bottom of the path, you come to the brook, with its little stone bridge across, and the footpath leading up the hill towards Whitley. There is another footpath that the Gatty girls might have taken to get to Whitley. They could have gone along the upper Shrogs until they came to the 20-acre field, and then turned right and gone down by the side of that field, which in its turn leads to a footpath down to the brook and across. This photograph shows the footpath as it nears the brook. Here's the bottom of the path where it crosses the brook with its picturesque little bridge and stile, and Mrs. Wrigley sits on the stile, but you could have crossed it and gone that way up to Whitley. I like to think that this was the cottage that the children were heading for when they took the soup. It's an old 18th century red brick building standing at the end of the bridle path that leads from Middleton Green to Whitley. When I went there recently, it had been completely altered. It had been plastered up and made into a more expensive building with its own garden in a rather nice position, but I liked it better as it was. This is the same cottage taken at a slightly different angle and taken on black and white film. It is round about the same date, in the 70s, perhaps a little later than the previous picture. On the other hand, it could have been these cottages, which are lower down the Whitley Valley, at a place where Whitley Lane and Elliot Lane converge. I took this photograph in the early 1970s. The horse and trap here is travelling down Whitley Lane approaching Elliot Lane, which runs off to the left. Below the cottages, that piece of land has changed use from being a pig farmer's, then it became a garden centre, and now a house has been built there. This photograph, taken about 40 years ago, shows the farm near the vicarage, just off Priory Road or Burying Lane, whichever you prefer. It's now been converted to a single house, and the outbuildings have been removed and replaced by bungalows, but at this date it was very much as how the Gattys would have known it. If you went up the drive and past the farmhouse and then turned left, you'd see another view of the outbuildings, with the back of the house shown where they joined them. This view of the farm and the outbuildings is a slightly different one to the one I've already shown, but I'd like to quote from one of the entries in Juliana's diary. Called with Auntie on Mrs. Greaves was the farmer's wife. She gave us cake and ale and entertained us with the history of the 3 preceding vicars and pedigrees of the neighbourhood. She was obviously somebody interested in local history. This gravestone marks the burial place of the vicar who preceded Alfred Gatty. It says on the stone, "Sacred to the memory of Thomas Richard Ryder, Vicar of Ecclesfield, youngest son of Thomas Ryder, Esquire of Hendon, Middlesex, who died July the 24th, 1839, aged 44 years. Thomas Ryder was the uncle of Alfred Gatty, so there may have been some nepotism in his obtaining this particular incumbency. Still on the subject of vicars who preceded the Gattys, I'd like to show you this picture, a painting that I bought many years ago. It's showing the church and a completely different vicarage. I presume this was the vicarage before the one that the Gattys occupied. It does look completely different, and I don't know of any other picture of what vicarage preceded the one that the Gattys occupied. I'm going to walk past the farm now up the drive to come to the hall, Ecclesfield Hall. It's a nice building built in the 18th century. There was a hall before that, but I've no pictures of it, and I don't know of any. This particular picture was drawn by one of the Gatty family, and it shows the hall as it was in their day. This is a more recent photograph of Ecclesfield Hall. It's interesting to compare not the hall itself, which corresponds with the drawing, but with the little outbuilding to the left of it. In this photograph it's a two-storey building, but in the one that was drawn it's a single small outbuilding. So at some time that extension to the left was put on after the drawing was made. It's difficult to get a photograph of the back of the hall, partly because of the constricted space and partly because you can't get far enough away from it. This is the best effort I could make. Walking past the hall we come to the priory. This is said to be the oldest building, and I'm sure it is, since it dates from the 13th century, that is 1200 and something. At one time it was connected with St Wandrill's Abbey in France, and they were responsible for placing a vicar to look after the parish. Apparently he didn't make a very good job of it, but by the time that Dr Gatty was resident in the vicarage, it had fallen into considerable disrepair. In fact, it was falling down, according to the doctor. He took it in hand and very much made it as it looks today, as you'll be able to see from the next photograph. If you flick backwards and forwards between the previous drawing and this photograph, you'll be able to see that there aren't many changes. You can spot a few, as I have done, but to say that the two pictures are separated by about 130 years, it's remarkable how little it's changed. This plan shows that the building on the right, which projects beyond the other building, was at one time the chapel, but it's now been converted on the ground floor to a bedroom, and above they've made it into a study. That is what it was at the time of the Gattys. It may now have changed yet again. Gatty had, throughout his long period at Ecclesfield, a succession of curates. They usually resided at the priory, and this picture shows Gatty late in his life being helped along by one of them. Possibly his most famous curate was the Reverend Eastwood. He wrote the history of the parish of Ecclesfield, but died very shortly after it was finished. From this point onwards I'm going to try to show you what the village of Ecclesfield and its surrounding areas would have looked like to the Gattys. This is St Mary's Lane as it was before it was levelled. You can see that it's quite a steep dip, and where the lane joins Church Street it's narrow now, but then it was particularly so. I date this round about 1903. This painting of St Mary's Lane leading up to the church was done by Juliana, and it's pretty much the same location as on the previous picture, so you'll be able to compare them if you flick backwards and forwards. Here we are at a place higher up the lane, nearing Hilltop. Hilltop was the place where St Mary's Lane became High Street, and it had a junction with Yew Lane. At the very top of St Mary's Lane was this cottage, and to its right was an old barn. When this barn was uncovered, it was shown to be a crook barn. It's now a bakery, so people who know Ecclesfield will know pretty well where I am. This is another view of the cottage that stood at the top of St Mary's Lane, opposite the bottom of Yew Lane. It was demolished shortly after I took this photograph in 1965. This shows the bottom of Yew Lane at Hilltop. On the left are the terraced houses with the corner shop, which was at one time belonging to a Mr. Nicholson, who was the local chemist for the village. On the right, those buildings have been demolished, the pair of cottages and the farmhouse. Here we are looking up Yew Lane from Hilltop at a much narrower lane. On the left, those old cottages were demolished to make way for the Eva Ratcliffe flats. They were facing the top of Stocks Hill. I guess this photograph will be around about 1908. These cottages have now been replaced. There are 4 of them, and they were replaced to make way for both the snooker club and also the new houses that stand above the snooker club. The block of cottages that I mentioned in the previous picture are here seen on the left, and we're looking down Yew Lane with the cottages that I also mentioned on the right and Stocks Hill running down to the left. This fine early photograph of the bottom of Yew Lane is interesting because it shows how narrow it was at that time. It's now much wider. Possibly the house on the left has been demolished, although there is a house stands there yet. Turning down Stocks Hill and going to the very bottom, we come to this group of buildings. On the left, the old post office, which no doubt the Gatties made good use of. Then a pair of semi-detached houses, a couple of white semi-detached cottages, and poking above them all is the Fairfees Hall. At the time of the Gatties, the Fairfees Hall was a school, but it later became a council hall or offices. Here you are looking across the square to the bottom of Stocks Hill and also to Church Street. From right to left you've got the old post office, the old Tankard Inn, now called the Stocks. The building at the side was once a slaughterhouse but is now part of the Stocks. Then the reading room with the church tower above it. Next to that, a pair of shops which, at the time this photograph was taken, was the George and Dragon pub. And on the very left you have a place which is very old. It was known as the Courthouse Antiques until quite recently, but now it's being closed, and I understand that it's to be changed into apartments. This photograph is worth showing because it shows the old White Bear, the one that preceded the present building, in its relationship to some of the other cottages and buildings that surrounded it. A neighbour of mine was born in the White Bear. Her name was Mrs. Leonard. I'm not sure what her maiden name was. Here is the White Bear again, in a similar photograph to the last one, but interesting because of the youngsters who gathered in the front of the picture. to see what was going on and to get onto it. Photography in those days was something to be witnessed. Here is the end of what was the White Bear. It's taken during its demolition. Can you see peeping behind it the old corner shop? That too has recently been turned into a house. Only quite recently, in fact, only this year, 2007. Here is the corner shop on Stocks Hill that I mentioned previously. If you look carefully, you can see the sweets arranged on the top shelf as you look through the window. It belonged to Mr. Woodcock, and it was taken in 1975. Opposite the post office is what most people know as the square, although it really is part of Stocks Hill. This gathering, this wit gathering, which was a common feature of the village, is interesting because it also gives a glimpse of those houses which were known as the Isles and can just be glimpsed in the top left-hand corner. Pictures of those are very, very scarce. In fact, I've not been able to find a really good picture of them. But this does give us a glimpse of them. The wit gathering would often be preceded by a parade throughout the various parts of the village, culminating in a gathering in the square where the vicar would address the multitude and hymns would be sung. It seems to have disappeared now. It doesn't take place at all. I captured this shot of the parade as they were passing down Wheater Road, and the date was 1958. Looking across from Stocks Hill towards Townend Road, the buildings from right to left were the courthouse. That's the name I've given it. It didn't have any particular name before. Then there's an alleyway which led up to a motor car restorer. Then the Griffin Inn, which is now the offices of Jaguar Estates. And then the Midland Bank, which closed even before it was taken over by HSBC. The City Library had taken over the library because it had taken over the whole of Ecclesfield. And shortly after this photograph was taken, it closed the little shop which was the library and installed a mobile library in the square. Now, the reason given, as I understand it, was that the little shop had no toilet facilities. But of course, neither did the mobile library, so it was a bit of a nonsense. But anyway, it closed, and eventually it was replaced by the new library on High Street. It's worth taking a closer look at this building, which for want of a better word I'll call the courthouse building, because here, before it was developed as an antiques centre, it looks pretty nondescript. The West Riding County Library can be seen clearly. Then another shop which is closed but I think was once a butcher's, and then a couple of cottages make up the whole of this particular building. It's not until you get inside that you realise how old it is. And on the next photograph I'd like to show you some of the beams that were there when the Courthouse Antiques had it, although now that is closed. Ignore here the rather enticing antiques at the bottom of the picture and concentrate on the beams. They are of the traditional crook structure which places this building probably back to the 17th century or even earlier. Here we are looking up Church Street. On the left, the shops, very similar to what they are today except for the people who own them. Don Valley Cleaners, Bolton's Bakery, Mrs. Booker's shop, which sold pretty well everything that you might need in an emergency. Then cottages, although now at least one of the cottages has been converted into a shop. In the distance you can see the courthouse building, and you can see up towards Townend Road. Looking down Church Street we have this useful view because it shows us the George and Dragon Inn. I've not seen another photograph of the George and Dragon, and even here we've only got half of it. And beyond is the reading rooms, and beyond that some shops which backed onto the churchyard. The shops and the reading room have all gone, of course, but we have, as I say, got this useful picture of the George and Dragon, which is difficult to photograph because you can't get far enough away from it to get the whole lot onto your camera. Townend Road led uphill towards Grenoside. On its way it became the Wheel, and then Wheel Lane, and by the time it became Wheel Lane it was part of Grenoside. It was a long road, about 2 miles in length. Here we're right at the very bottom of it. On the right there's some kind of an industrial business because there's a chimney, but I'm not sure what that was. If you look at the white building, that was a shop, and further down you're getting towards the backs of the Isles buildings. So I've enlarged this and I'll show it you in the next picture. I've selected the centre part of the previous picture and enlarged it so you can look further down Townend Road at some of the buildings which have now gone. I've included this old view of Ecclesfield because it's overlooking the houses on Townend Road. The building centre left is the new Gatty Hall, which was built in 1903, so I guess this particular photograph dates from about 1905. I'm looking here down on Townend Road from the fields which are approached from New Lane, and the most prominent building that you can see is the Independent Chapel that was built in 1819. On the next photograph I'll show you the front of it. Here is the front of the chapel, but by the time I took this photograph it was no longer in use as a chapel. It was in use by an amateur dramatics group known as the Ecclesfield Priory Players. They no longer occupy it, and it's now a private house. Here we are looking down on Townend Road at the place where it changes its name and becomes the Wheel. In the centre is Townend Farm, and in front of Townend Farm are allotments. If you go there now, there are many new houses which would obscure this view. It's interesting to compare this picture of Townend Farm barn as it was shown on the previous picture, because there's not a great deal of alteration, considering that the two photographs are separated by over a century in time. 100 or so yards above the farm, a little lane runs off to the right. It's Cinder Hill Lane. It's shown here from a recent photograph with the Whitley Hall cricket ground just visible on the right. It leads up to Middleton Green and beyond Middleton Green towards Grenoside. A very interesting feature of Cinder Hill Lane is this ancient stone footpath. It must be hundreds of years old, and one wonders what its purpose was. My own conjecture is that when the road was very muddy, as it often would be, it provided a means for people to pass by without getting the boots too wet. But it is an interesting feature and worth looking out for. In her diary, Juliana frequently mentions the natural history of the district, and she's particularly taken by the way in which the stones become covered in moss. And it's easy to see this still if you walk up Cinder Hill Lane. This and the next picture were both taken on the lane. These mossy stones are part of the lane near where it joins Middleton Lane and leads on to Grenoside. Middleton Green is a dear little hamlet that consists of just a few cottages and a farm. Well, at least it did consist of a farm, but that's been now made into a house. The cottages are still there, and it's situated where Cinder Hill Lane takes a sharp left turn as you're going up the hill. Middleton Green 1975, with this magnificent tree. If you compare the previous picture with this, you'll see how the tree has been chopped about. This is another photograph of Middleton Green Farm, taken again in 1975. This is Middleton Lane, where it takes a turn away from Cinder Hill Lane and joins Wheel Lane. The cottages are old, but of course they've been done up now for modern residents. I remember passing it in the 1950s when the previous occupants had moved out and they were in rather a derelict state, but of course they've been redone and now they are quite attractive houses. If I go farther up the wheel, I shall be encroaching on the Grenoside part of the road, so we'll return now to Church Street and to two shops which stood opposite the church. I say stood because both of them have now been changed into houses. On the left is a grocer's shop, a beer-off shop, and on the right Bennett's Butcher's. Now, I don't believe that all these people were customers. I think what's happened here is that they've got in on the act because they were working on the roads at the time. So we've got a mixture here of shopkeepers and road workers. This is the grocer's shop that was standing next to the butcher's shop. It survived until quite recent times and now has been changed into a house, but I remember when the last person who had it was Mrs. Caldwell. It was very much a village shop where there were chairs for customers to sit and talk and pass the time of day, and Mrs. Caldwell produced her own boiled ham, which was renowned in the village, but it's all gone now and it's just a house again. Here we have another view of Old Church Street, looking downhill with the lower part of the churchyard on the left. Back on High Street now, where it joins St Mary's Lane, and we're looking towards Sheffield, which is the direction we're going to go. On the left are the cottages, which have now been replaced by a modern housing development, and on the right is the farmhouse of a farm that stood at the corner of High Street and New Lane. This gives a better view of the farm that stood at the corner of High Street and New Lane. It was demolished in the 1950s, I think about 1958 probably, and it was replaced by special apartments and flats for older people. If we go up High Street for about 200-300 yards and turn and look back, this is the view we would see. On the left are the cottages, which I've shown in a previous picture, and we're getting now towards the junction with Greaves Road. Further along High Street we come to Fairfields Road, and this quaint little cottage with its outbuildings, which at that time housed two shops, one of which belonged to a Mr. Slyke, a driving instructor, and the other I think was a sweet shop. Now it's been modernised and the outbuildings have been added to the house. When it was being modernised, it was revealed as another Crook building, and possibly of 17th, possibly 16th century date. On the other side of the road, here we are standing at Greaves Road, at the junction with Greaves Road. On the corner was this little old detached house, which latterly has had extensions added to it. Next to it was the Rawson Infant School, and next to that was the old police station, and here we're looking back towards New Lane. This is a photograph dating from 1967. Back on the left hand side as we go towards Sheffield, we now reach a group of very old cottages. One of them protruded sideways onto the road, and it's shown here because it was the surgery of a Dr. Labob Bottriss. Some old Ecclesfieldians may remember Dr. Bottriss. I don't personally remember him, but this was his surgery, and compared with modern surgeries it is rather a primitive affair. When I say that Dr. Bottriss's surgery was part of a larger block of cottages, there are another couple here. You can see how they were attached, and they were old, very old. No one knows really how old they were, but anyway they've gone now and been replaced by a modern block of terraced houses. I'd like you to have a closer look at this shop and its outbuildings. Of course it's gone now, but it was an old shop, although it's been tacked onto the other cottages. But look at the side of the house. It seems that at one time it was either a miller's or a baker's house, because there's a doorway on the first floor. Also behind it are some interesting buildings. It's a pity I haven't got closer pictures of them, but they too have gone. On the other side of the road is another farm. It was Singleton's farm in 1903, but Singleton's eventually gave up farming and went into the haulage business. So now it's no longer a farm, and it's difficult to get a decent picture of it because there are usually lorries parked in the way. But the farm building that we can see here is believed to be one of the oldest in Ecclesfield, and it's now being used, as I said, as a haulage contractor. I took this photograph of the Singleton farm buildings quite recently, when I was able to get a better view, since there was only one motor vehicle in front of it. On the opposite side of the road to Singleton's farm was this three-roofed house. I say it was because although the house has not been demolished, the roof structure has been altered to make it a more normal dwelling. It has a garden in front, and on this garden at one time stood two cottages which I shall show you. This pair of cottages stood in front of the three-roofed house. There is a story that Wesley stayed in one of them. Wesley, Charles Wesley, was the founder of Methodism, and Methodism wasn't at all popular at one time in Ecclesfield. In fact, there were some confrontations between the Wesleyans and the traditional, ordinary Church of England Christians. How true that is, I'm not sure. This pair of cottages was a little further towards Sheffield, on the opposite side to the previous picture. It's now a single cottage, and the whole thing has been improved and altered structurally to make it into a single house. When this photograph was taken in the 1960s, this high street was still in use. It was the main street through the village. It's now become just a parking place, and a new road has been built to the left of this picture where the shopping centre and the library are. This is a backward view of Wallet End, looking towards Sycamore Road, and in the distance you can see the Sportsman Inn, but on the left you can also see other cottages. The Sportsman Inn, seen here, stood just about where the library stands today. To the right of it are two older houses, considerably older than the Sportsman itself, which is probably late Victorian. Some time later I was in this same area again, and I took this photograph after the houses, which you've seen, had been demolished, leaving the Sportsman and a blank space. But in the blank space was revealed quite an old cottage. I would say very old. 17th century, possibly even earlier than that. I'm afraid that the West Riding wasn't a very conservationist authority. They were quite prepared to knock things down. In fact, I think one of the councillors once said he wouldn't be satisfied until every old building had been replaced by something a bit more modern. That was the attitude. This colour photograph shows a closer look at the cottage, but can you see, nestling between the cottage and the notice board is a tiny workshop. Old Mr. Ridge was a gimlet maker, and at the time this photograph was taken he was still producing handmade gimlets. This photograph of Mr. Ridge making one of his gimlets was taken by my friend David Richardson, and I'm putting it in as a tribute to the many little mesters who worked in all those workshops that are scattered about Ecclesfield, making nails and forks, gimlets and all the other artifacts that could be handmade in those days. The neighbouring cottages to the one I've just shown are here seen taken around about the same time in the late 1960s. Unfortunately, the frame that contains this picture was right at the end of the reel, and so unfortunately part of it got missed, but I put it in because it's the only photograph that I know of that shows this pair of cottages, so you'll have to put up with a little bit of spoilage on the extreme right of the photograph. This photograph shows the last days of the old High Street. It's still in use as a highway for motor cars and other vehicles, but its days are numbered because all the buildings have been cleared, and we're waiting now for the new bypass to be built and for the new shopping centre and the library, which is now so familiar to us. We've come now past the Greyhound pub and the bottom of Wordsworth Avenue to look at the extension of High Street. The house I'm showing is the house known as Bank House, which was built in 1870. It's now undergoing considerable development around it, and it's been incorporated in a completely new series of buildings. When I knew it back in the 1950s, old Mr. Rushby kept a kind of nursery there for plants. You could go through the garden, which was quite a considerable walk through his garden to his greenhouses, and there you could buy your dahlia plants or your tomato plants or your bedding plants. But as I say, that's a memory of the past, and now it's being completely redeveloped. Here the photographer would have been standing about where Wordsworth Avenue goes off to the right, and you can see that there are cottages on the left and also cottages on the right. I'm not sure about the motor vehicle. It's already appeared in another photograph. It looks as if someone was making an expedition of a visit to Ecclesfield to take photographs. I'd like to concentrate now on another part of Ecclesfield, namely the Common. This photograph was taken around about the 1930s, and it shows the junction between the Common and, on the right, Nether Lane, and on the left, Mill Road, formerly known as Dog's Leg Lane. You can see the signpost, and you can see the little shed. That is roughly where the Royal Bank of Scotland now stands, and the little shed may be the same one that houses the butchers, but I think it's been replaced by a more modern building. This photograph dates from about 1930, and it shows the Common at its junction with Mill Road on the left. The two buildings were the mill house and the mill itself. It was a corn mill, and behind it would have been the dam, which now is in use partly as a car park and partly as a car sales room, and it was here that the corn for the village of Ecclesfield would be ground in the days when it was a village. I took this photograph in the 1970s from what is now Ecclesfield Park car park, looking across to the old foundry. At one time it belonged to William Green, who was a manufacturer of the old ranges, you know, the cooking ranges, the old Yorkshire ranges that we remember from our childhood. These old cottages, which were already in a dilapidated state, disappeared completely when Morrison's supermarket was developed, but I did manage to get this photograph of them in 1974 before they disappeared forever. I acquired this photograph many years ago in an album of photographs of Ecclesfield, and it was captioned on the back, "Springtime in Ecclesfield." Now that makes it certain that it's part of the village of Ecclesfield, or possibly was part of the village of Ecclesfield. So I'd like to know exactly where it was. Anybody who can help, I'd love to be able to put a location to it. This picture, taken towards the end of the old man's life, appears to show him at a christening, possibly of a great-grandchild or a godchild. I've got so many more pictures that I could show, but I think this has gone on long enough. Possibly I may come back with another one at some time in the future. Thank you for watching.